Thank you very much. Madam President and members, I rise in opposition to this budget as presented in this particular bill. I think in response to some of the comments made throughout the day here, because I think this has been a constructive debate, but I would beg to differ, and if Senator Dutton were here on the floor, I think he would agree with me that, in fact, we have been having this debate since January, members. Maybe not all of you were engaged in it, and maybe some of you didn't attend the budget hearings and hours of testimony and discussion on many of these proposals that have occurred. But they have occurred, members. They have occurred in public. We have heard from the public. We have heard from the legislative analyst. We have heard from the Department of Finance. And we have discussed things among members. And frankly, despite the differences that have been highlighted here today, I think it's important for us as we move and to debate the alternative that will be presented in a few moments to think about narrowing those differences. But I also want to say, and I think in tune with some of the comments made by Senator Cedillo and others here, I rise in opposition to this budget because it is just too pessimistic. It is not a budget that is worthy of California. It is not a budget that reflects the values of Californians. And it is not a budget that will move California forward. And it isn't as complicated and as difficult on the economics as some people have tried to make it here. The true difference between the two budget proposals that are being presented today is really about $4 billion. And the choices, people talked earlier, and this is true, budgets are about choices. And the choice that the budget before us makes, that the governor made in his May revision, is to protect tax cuts, not to do tax increases, members, but to protect future tax cuts in the budget year. And he pays for those $4 billion in scheduled tax reductions, half of which would otherwise be paid by corporations, and half of which would come from us individually, each paying 0.25% more in personal income tax than we paid 2 years ago, but not one dime more than we paid in the current fiscal year, budget year, or calendar year. And to protect that cut, because that is what we're paying for here, members. Let's not get confused. What this budget pays for is a tax cut of $4 billion to take effect in 2011. And it pays for that tax cut, because we have to have a balanced budget, by eliminating the most successful welfare to work program in the country, by which serves over 1 million children and 500,000 plus families, and helps them get jobs, helps them be trained to become those jobs that everybody's talking about, helps subsidize small business employers and others to hire those folks to keep this economy going. And in order to not spend that $1 billion, we give up, we return back to Washington for redistribution to other states over $4 billion of our federal tax funds, our federal dollars from California. We send those back. And what would happen with those dollars if they were here? They are spent in our neighborhood grocery stores. They buy necessities for children. They buy food. They pay rent. They pay mortgages. That's what that money does. A program that has not increased spending and, in fact, has donated to the general fund for the last several years. A program that improved our welfare to work rates, in half, cut our welfare rolls in half in less than 10 years. It has upticked the last couple of years because of the recession, there's no question, but we are still at less than half of what we were in 1994. The grant amount that those families are receiving, that many would argue is too much, that we somehow can't afford, is about the same as it was when George Ducheny was governor. It's been about the same as it was in 1989. On a dollar-for-dollar basis, not even on an inflation-adjusted basis. What else does it use to pay for these tax cuts? It pays for these tax cuts by eliminating child care. And what does that do? Elimination of child care means about several thousand businesses, small businesses in California will close, will fire their employees, and will no longer be available to help other families go to work by caring for their children in a safe way while they go to work. That's where the 300 to 400,000 jobs that we talk about being lost by this budget, that's where a lot of it is. The other way that is paying is the $750 million proposed, although unspecified in this budget, as presented, because we have asked that question over and over in finance and LAO. How do you get $750 million in IHSS savings? Nobody has yet presented, and I understand this budget still does not have a clear roadmap of what you could do to change the program to actually get there. Certainly that would be legal. And where's the other major pieces? Well, you know, we have accepted, and so the difference is, you know, many of the cuts that were done last year that people talked about have already been accounted for throughout this budget process. So we are down, members, to sort of that fundamental, the other $2 billion of the $4 billion is in education. People will say, although many would argue that legally this budget, although it claims to fund 98, does not, and it is a massive manipulation of 98 that makes it questionable whether it could actually be sustained in any way. But regardless of the effects of 98 per se and whether we're funding it or suspending it, the difference is a $2 billion reduction in education. This budget that the governor presented, that is before us at the moment, spends almost $1,000 less per pupil in K-12 education than the budget of 2007. So in 3 years, members, we have managed to work our way to spending $1,000 less per child under this governor's budget. So that's the $4 billion, folks. It's $2 billion in education. It's $1 billion plus the $5 billion we lose in federal funds for CalWORKs, and the $1 billion that we lose in child care under this budget. It's a total of 400,000 jobs that will be lost, and leading us not upward, members, and not toward a future, but in a death spiral for the economy and for who California is and was. Members, this budget is not worthy of who we have been and who we are. We are a state of the future. We are a state that has always looked forward, has always done everything to move this country forward, to move a lot of new technologies forward, to move forward and invest in this economy. You know, and despite all of our sour economic discussion here, the articles I read, I think it was last week in the Union Tribune, says that 50% of all venture capital that is being invested in new technologies in this country right now are being invested in California. And people come here and those businesses have stayed here because we have had roads, because we have had schools, because we have had universities that produce the workforce that invented all of those new technologies. We cannot give up that California, and we cannot afford, when you say we can't afford it, what we can't afford to do, members, is vote for this budget. We cannot afford to give up all of those resources, to give up our federal tax dollars, to have 1 million children facing homelessness, to stop, to not restore, to leave, as this governor's budget does, child welfare decimated. We have children who are not being placed, who are not being, the social workers cannot respond timely to child abuse complaints because of the $100 billion that this governor vetoed from last year's budget that all of us supported. I agree. But this governor vetoed $80 million in general fund, which adds to more because of federal funds, child welfare services, members, and this budget before you does not restore that money. That's just wrong, and it is beneath us as Californians in a $1.5 trillion economy to say that we can't find a way to cover that $4 billion, billion, small b, not T, worth of differences that are holding us apart. Yes, this should have been done earlier. This debate has been going on all year, and I'm sorry if some of you weren't part of it. But this debate hasn't changed. And we have struggled in conference, and we have struggled through the committees to narrow these differences, to find a lot of compromises, to take LAO suggestions on savings, to do all of those things. But what we can't do is go back to where this budget is in May and suggest that California cannot have the future of our children and that we're going to pay for tax cuts, that we're not each willing to put up that extra quarter in order to prevent the death spiral of California and to leave ourselves with a whole generation of children left on the streets, left without homes, left without food, and left without education. That just doesn't make sense, members. It is just not a way to do business. Ask for your no vote.